Welcome to our webinar, Leadership Options for Restoring Order or Trust in the Face of Relentless Chaos. Leadership is about influence, the capacity to make change or maintain the status quo. Under circumstances of an immediate existential threat, leaders are expected to take action, to command without consultation. Consider the fear of a pandemic or of a famine or of the threat of a nuclear annihilation. Otherwise, in the absence of an immediate existential threat, to initiate change, that is some form of consultation with the leader's constituency, which is the source of power and influence, is expected. I emphasize some form as the options for consultation are many, ranging from an election to a commission, a study, even just a walkabout. To violate the principles of consulting in the absence of an imminent threat is to risk losing leadership, the power to influence. Now comes the really tricky part for public leadership. When does chaos become an existential threat? Think protests, such as the convoys in Ottawa and the occupiers in Seattle, or COVID captives in Shanghai and insurgents in Washington, freedoms threatened and tanks invading the Ukraine. Since fear can be created, such as through fake news, is it ethical for a leader to instill fear in the interest of stirring up the sense of there being an existential threat and therefore warranting, commanding action without consultation, possibly in the interest of accumulating even more power? Throughout our year-long series of webinars, we've been exploring the sources and forces of change, the threats and opportunities contributing to public fear and chaos, uncertainty, and the erosion of trust. Public health, as with COVID and associated mandates. Security, as with ransomware. Artificial intelligence and data surveillance, the war, inflation, supply chain disruptions, and induced food, energy, and computer chips shortages. Yet, of course, the ever-present claim of an existential crisis of climate change. Typically, the impact of most interest to us has been the concrete impact on the economy. Of lesser interest has been the softer impact of fear on social cohesion and trust. Those fears can imperil the very foundations of our liberal institutions of health and education, law and order, and good governance. And on a global scale, these fears can shake our confidence in free trade, the merit of globalization and international agreements, and even institutions such as the United Nations. We've heard, concluding the webinar on the war's impact on Canada and energy last week, that Canada, with its vast natural resources and global brand as a peacekeeper, could play a strong leadership role on a global scale. Thank you for your input on that. With that perspective, Axel Meeson. For today's webinar, we're exploring leadership and the options for restoring order and trust in the face of relentless chaos. I, as your host, will also serve as moderator and have the pleasure of introducing you to our three presenters, Doug Furby, who will launch this session, Robert Walker, and Peter Stockland before we initiate an open discussion. Each bring a somewhat different perspective to what leaders need to do today in the challenge of restoring order, call it trust, in the face of relentless chaos, fear, and prevailing uncertainty. First to speak will be Doug Furby. We'll entertain a commentary and public discussion after the three presenters, and in the meantime, use your chat function and please mute your mic. Doug, your turn. And please give us a glimpse of your background and your interest in the subject of leadership.
Well, thank you, Perry, for that excellent contextual introduction. I think that really lays out some of the challenges that we face right now. I was involved in public policy discussions for many years through working at various newspapers. For 8 years, I was the editorial page editor at the Calgary Herald, and my distinguished friend Peter Stockland preceded me in that role. I've gone on to get heavily involved in Troy Media, which many of you I'm sure are familiar with, independent distributor of editorial content across the country. And I stay engaged on this topic because I think it's one of, to use Perry's words, one of the existential threats that we face these days. Perry, if I run on too long, feel free to just jump in and stop me at some point. I know that we only have so much time. And I could probably talk for a whole hour on my own, but that's not the point here. We want to hear from everybody. But I'll jump in. Some of you will remember the 1972 film A Candidate, in which a political specialist named Marvin Lucas was charged with finding a fitting contender for California senator. He seeks out Bill McKay, a role played by Robert Redford, an idealistic, handsome, and charismatic son of the former California governor. A firm underdog, the candidate gradually compromises his ideals, tones down his rhetoric, and finally makes deals with the union to win the election. That was a fictional story, but sadly, it's borne out in real world politics. It seems that you can either be true to yourself or you can win office. It's very hard to do both. When I was preparing for today, I thought about what did LinkedIn say about top traits to be found in a leader. So I had a look, and they list qualities like accountability, adaptability, confidence, creativity, empathy, focus, positivity, risk taking, stability, and team building. Those are all good qualities. But what's missing from that list? I would say honesty, vision, the ability to inspire, the ability to communicate. Think about Ronald Reagan. He wasn't much of a policy wonk, perhaps, but his ability to communicate in a compelling fashion backstopped many of his successes. Who could ever forget Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall? Compare that to the gibberish we hear from many of our current political leaders. Scripted answers written by backroom staff that effectively evade answering whatever question was posed. Great leaders, in my view, are not afraid to speak provocatively and ad lib. Think of Trudeau Sr., just watch me, or Ralph Klein, when he was asked by a reporter on the eve of his first election as premier whether Albertans were ready to elect an alcoholic. He reportedly answered, "We're about to find out." You don't see that these days. Good leaders are not gods, they're not perfect people. I'm a fan of Winston Churchill, and as you know, in his early days, he had a mixed record for his leadership. He was blamed, for example, for the disastrous raid on Gallipoli in World War One. A lot of leaders don't appear to be great leaders until their moment arrives. For Churchill, it was his foresight on Hitler's rise, and then his steadfast resolve in standing up to a daunting enemy. For Vladimir Zelensky, his approval ratings were very low until Russia invaded Ukraine. Then his courageous stand transformed him into an inspiring leader. Think of some of the great world leaders: Churchill, Gandhi, Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., Havel, Zelensky. Where are the Canadian leaders? Well, about nearly 20 years ago now, CBC held a contest, the greatest Canadian. And who was chosen? Tommy Douglas. And arguably, he was a great leader. They also ranked Pierre Trudeau very highly. Not a popular guy in our province for good reason, but he was decisive. And I would argue at the provincial level, you should look at names like Joey Smallwood and Ralph Klein. What's missing in this list? There's been no federal leader who would be considered capable of fulfilling all of those requirements since Trudeau retired in the 80s. Political leaders are not unlike corporate leaders. Many of the same qualities are required. In 2016, Forbes magazine participated in something called the Potential Project, and it was a 2-year study of 35,000 leaders, corporate leaders, around the world. A Gallup poll done for that study found that only 18%, 1 in 5 managers demonstrate a high level of talent for managing others. That means 8 in 10 managers aren't very good at leading people. I wonder whether politicians are much different than that. That same study found that the qualities organizations select for and reward: ambition, perfectionism, competitiveness, are the very ones that are unlikely to produce leaders who are good for long-term organizational performance. In other words, leaders who get ahead are the ones who are good at kneecapping the competition. I guess one could think of Jason Kenney and his strategies to beat Brian Jean for the UCP leadership as a case in point. The potential project study also found that many leaders, when they start to feel powerful, their more benevolent qualities like empathy start to decline. In other words, power corrupts. Think of the senior Trudeau again, or for that matter, Stephen Harper, and both of those leaders' tendency to centralize power in their respective offices. So the question is, what do we need in a leader today? To me, the answer is the same as it has been for the ages, and it includes the qualities that I talked about a few minutes ago. They also need to be on Twitter, apparently, and embrace other forms of new technologies. But first and foremost, they must be grounded in their values, be open, honest, transparent, and they must be willing to put people's interests ahead of their parties or their own. There's one thought I'd like to leave you with in these opening comments, and it's some disturbing research by the Edelman organization, which annually does its trust barometer. Some of you are likely familiar with that. In the most recent report, it looked at the trust in corporate leaders and political leaders around the world. And one of the questions that was asked when they did their study was, do you believe you have been purposely misled by your government leaders? 58% of the respondents, 6 out of 10 people, said yes, they do believe they were misled by their government leaders. So we have a problem. We have a malaise, and we need to find a way to solve it. I think I'll stop there and let others speak, but that's my perspective on the issues that we're facing.
Thank you, Doug. That was superb. You laid out the identity and some of the features associated with leadership. What's very interesting, and we'll come back to this during the discussion, most of the leaders that you cited were leaders that one might say were humanists in one way or another, respecting the values of people. But Caesar was a leader. Napoleon was a leader. Eisenhower was a leader. Hitler was a leader in the sense of mobilizing power. There's something more than simply the mobilizing of power that makes for greatness, at least a historical assessment of greatness, and we'll come back to that later.
Yeah.
In any case, welcome, Robert, your turn, and please give us a little bit of your background as well.
Yeah, okay. Well, look, thanks, thanks, Perry. Thanks, Doug. I guess my remarks are going to come at the question of leadership through a somewhat different lens. So I've had a career spanning almost 40 years, now retired, but almost 40 years in government as a scientist, a manager, and executive, and in many of those roles as an advisor to senior public servants, being one myself, and to regulators and to politicians. And much of that career has been in the security and defense space. So when Perry said he wanted to talk about the chaotic world, I said, well, I think I've got something to talk about here, because for much of my career, I've been engaged in looking at what's chaotic and what's about to become chaotic, and what advice could I provide to decision makers from a science perspective. So perhaps his focus is going to be a lot on what's different today than when my career started nearly 40 years ago, and it is profoundly different. And then within that, are there enduring characteristics of leadership that we need to focus on? And to not give my story away, in my mind, it comes back to where you ended up, Doug. It's about values. So, but perhaps this is a bit of a Monty Python story, and now for something completely different. And we'll see where this takes us, but let's start. And so my opening gambit here is that for public authorities, and they're more than politicians, but we'll come back and talk about that in a moment. Decision making is tough stuff, and frankly, it's getting a lot tougher. There's many reasons for this. We have this enormous complexity of issues, grand challenges that bring together social, political, and technological perspectives. And there's the interdependence of issues. We have climate change, and we have a war in Ukraine that's making energy security a top of mind issue. The pace of technological disruptions that are going on in society is unprecedented in human history, and it's only getting faster. We have the phenomenon of social media, which we as a society have not been able to come to grips with yet when it comes to misinformation. We have the three Ps that seems to be in Western democracies, at least, to be the mantra today of politicization of everything, partisanship of everything, and polarization of everything. And we have another reality, which is an evolution of the role of science in society and the way it contributes into thought processes and decision making. So what's my bottom line? We've seen a declining public trust in what's been the view of public authorities in the past and traditional experts. So I'm going to explore a bit as to why I think that's happening, and perhaps then segue into discussions as what we can do about it. So let's begin. This is a reality that I think at times just simply needs to be stated. And unlike any time in the past of human history, we see the world in this enormous paradox. Never has it been more interdependent, more interconnected. Supply chains, financial markets, critical infrastructure, and then matters of global health and global warming and public health that are consequences of the interconnectedness. That interconnectedness is a consequence of technology, communications technology, transportation technology. And at the same time, the world is highly fractured along social lines, ideology, culture, values, wealth. What is the consequence of this paradox, this interconnectedness, and this fracture coming together? It's that the world is going to surprise us. And it's going to surprise us with increasing frequency. Here's my list. I just made this up this afternoon here, Perry. You add your own list. Of course, put the war in Ukraine on the list here and all the consequences of that. And it's in that reality where public authorities who come to office with agendas frequently find that week Tuesday, their agenda is turned on its head because the world has gone in a different direction, and they're forced to be able to respond to that. So a perspective on security for Canada is in this diagram I'm going to build a bit for you. So the first issue is, what are the attributes of our nation, of our society, that define us, that enable us, and that we value and want to protect, from the concept of sovereignty to our institutions, to our economy, to our critical infrastructure, to our approach to health, to our economy, and fundamentally issues of ideology. On the other side of the coin, we have threats to that reality through a variety of mechanisms and actors, from Mother Nature through to terrorism and conflict, to the phenomenon of radicalization and crime. And then we have a number of what I've come to call threat multipliers, matters that out there that, on the one hand, when solved, can be economic opportunity, but when not solved, actually exacerbate the threats to our society. And in that is even globalization of science and technology, which generally is looked at as an upside, but there are actually a number of downsides as science becomes and technology is leveraged by threat actors to attack us, cybersecurity being an example. And here's my message, is that these perspectives are interdependent, and that when something happens, such as interstate conflict, war in Ukraine, you see a push on energy security. Energy security has a push on the economy. And it's that dynamic in which leaders are inevitably forced to operate. A second perspective then is the big view of these collective challenges and their interdependency. I expect all of you are aware of this, but it begs repeating that At the UN level, we have its 17 Sustainable Development Goals. These are getting a bit dated. They've been around now since the mid 2000s, but they've been a powerful lever, particularly in with our youth and our universities, as providing a framework through which we're looking at the investments in education and research of our next leaders coming through our universities and colleges and trying to solve the problems that they're inheriting from us. These are enormously big, wicked problems. Number one, no poverty. Number two is zero hunger. Down to number 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions. The UN has done a great job, I think, in galvanized global action around this. However, there's no accountability for delivery against these here, perhaps the fundamental weakness. But that is one perspective. I actually find more intriguing this list of grand challenges that is actually the list put forward by the granting councils of the federal government that fund academic research as 16 perspectives on the problems that we see coming into the scope of reality today that we need, frankly, Canada's best minds to be focused on how do we solve them. From issues around the economy, of the digital economy to global health, issues in society, this notion of the asocial society where we're becoming individualistic and not really valuing communities, to shifting dynamic of privilege and marginalization, to the changing perspective on gender, to inhabiting challenging environments, into technology. We are becoming a surveillance society. Where is the balance between the risk and benefit? The manner in which technology can enhance humanity into what's called humanity plus. And of course, this is the emerging age of bio, everything bio. In the environment space, to living within our Earth's carrying capacity and the fact that there's hardly a part of nature that's not somehow being contaminated with human presence, to fundamental challenges on governance systems that actually work, the changing nature of security and conflict, and finally, this really does resonate, I'm sure, with all of us: truth under fire in a post-fact world. And finally, to arts and culture, where arts are going as a reflection of our human being into an erosion of culture and history. All to say that these issues, you look at them in 16, and we ask people to do a deep dive on any one of them. For leaders, they're actually working at the confluence of these issues at the same time. I want to come back and talk a bit about this idea of technology and technological disruption. I think I heard remarks in your comments in your opening remarks, Perry, about the world we live now, where we see a number of what are called platform technologies, from AI to quantum to nano to genomics, that are seeing a plethora of technological innovations coming forward that are disrupting markets. However, for leaders, it only starts with the markets. And this I would say is oftentimes the under-recognized reality of the disruptions that occur from technological advances, or that technology enables an innovation that disrupts. Witness Shopify or Google. And it's actually the way that disruption plays into market dynamics, societal dynamics, dynamics around health, safety, and security, and finally into government, or perhaps I could call it even governance. And we tend to see the physical sciences that are the face to disruptions that go out through the red arrows, but it's often the green arrows, those secondary disruption pathways, the world of the social sciences, where actually the great pressures for public authorities actually reside. What on earth is Bob talking about? Let me try to make this real for you by looking at it a couple examples. And perhaps the obvious one is start with automation, the recreation of the manufacturing sector globally. You may challenge me on my stats here, but I believe the stats are in, and about 80% of the job loss in North America and Europe due to in manufacturing is a product of automation and only 20% a product of outsourcing. The jobs have been lost, they're not coming back. And so, yes, we have a dynamic where automation has impacted the market, but what it's also done is eroded the Western middle class. These were good jobs. That's played into societal dynamics. And that's one of the key contributors to the growth in populism and the whole impact that that has had on government dynamics. Let me give you another example, which is perhaps self-evident, but social media. And what's it happened? I mean, social media has profoundly changed and is changing our social dynamics. On the one hand, it's created this new reality called the attention economy, where what's the attention span of young people these days, and how markets play into that. There's some negative sides playing into health, safety, and security, where social media has been a platform for online radicalization. It's enabled cybersecurity. And then we look into government dynamics of how that social media has given voice to the democratization of decision-making, to phenomena such as cyberbullying, and of course, to fake news. So, and as I pointed out, it's those green arrows and trying to understand how all of that plays out, where the real hard stuff sits for public authorities. And I would say invariably, even though the weak signals are out there, that we have glimpses that as technology disruptions take hold of markets and society, that there's going to be needed changes in public policy. But invariably we are late to game and picking up the pieces after the negative effects are out there. Okay, so let's come back. I made a hint earlier on that the relationship between science and society is also changing, and this is actually quite profound. I would say that you go back over 200 years, and that the general relationship between scientists and society is one of trust, of respect. That's eroding. And there's a number of reasons for that. This is Bob's list. I mean, social scientists study this quite ad nauseum. And you would say, well, hold it now. Science is about facts. Science is about evidence. So what's the problem? Well, there are deep problems here. One is the language of science, when the scientific method, the concept of an hypothesis and a theory, the probability, likelihood, uncertainty, these words get lost in translation when scientists try to put caveats on what their evidence is suggesting to decision makers. There's a notion of risk acceptance in science. When one says a vaccine is effective, there's always the caveat, effective enough, and it's safe, the caveat being safe enough. And for society, is it prepared to take the word of the scientist to say that I consider this to be an appropriate balance between effectiveness and safety? There's a connection between science and activism. You see how I quote this here: the scientific evidence shows that nuclear energy is the safest, I'll hold it now, the most dangerous form of energy generation, and both perspectives are out there. I'm going to come back and talk a bit about this concept of motivated reasoning, but it ends up with perspectives as diverse as we believe there is definitive scientific evidence that linking climate change to human activity, to there is no definitive scientific evidence. Science and social license. Despite the fact that the regulator has approved a project, the community is not going to support it because it doesn't trust the regulator. Science and social media. You'll find it out there that if for every doctor who stands up and says the government's taking the right approach to the pandemic, you can find one that says they're taking the wrong approach. And then finally, the reality that oftentimes science is working at the interface where public goods are in conflict. Yes, we need to take the advice of our public health experts, and now by consequence, we're shutting down our workplaces, our schools, and our borders. and so on. So this, I want to just briefly highlight this reality of motivated reasoning, something with my work at the as a senior fellow at the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy at the University of Ottawa. Peter's connected with this group as well. That's really come home to me. We, as it is a natural product of the human condition that we all of us, I'm looking in the mirror, Bob Walker does this, we exercise motivated reasoning. We all have a worldview. You'll see a list of my beliefs, truths, values, community, experiences, family, influences, sources. Who do I trust? Who do I distrust? And when we receive new evidence or a new claim coming from somewhere, we look at it explicitly and more often times implicitly through our worldview to say whether that new claim or evidence is consistent or inconsistent with my worldview. And what happens is we don't change our worldview. We either accept or reject that evidence. And this is enormously problematic and a key source of the polarizations we often see with conspiracy theories, fake news playing into the divide that's getting exacerbated by social media. So to wrap this up here, Perry, just 2 more slides here. I just wanted to provide a bit of a framework for thinking about decision making by public authorities. And first off, in the governance context, while politicians are key actors in the public authority space, they are not the only ones. We have obviously judges, order and council appointments, political staff, public servants, and we have a variety of institutions through which those public authorities operate. Those decisions relate to legislation, to agreements, to how you spend money, how you earn money. And those actors and institutions in the governance space are connected to the real world through a number of vectors. We have experts and advisors, like scientists and academics are in that, but not only. We have peers and partners, the FPTMI, federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, indigenous. We have a variety of influencers from constituencies to activists. And you put this together, and what social scientists tell us, at the end of the day, public trust is viewed through the intersection of 3 attributes through those decisions taken. One is competence, one is honesty, and one is benevolence. And you, Doug, you explicitly mentioned a couple of those, and I took from your words an inference to all 3 of them. But I think it's that intersection of 3 that brings public trust. What's missing on the chart? That's what's missing. Values. And I'm not saying I've got the list right. This is Bob's list, but from respecting lines of respecting our Constitution, the concepts of accountability, use evidence where it's available, enormously important, the rule of law. This concept of justice is about equity and fairness, so transparency. It's about listening. And I want to just wrap this up with an example of how I think this could look in practice here. Let me just do that. You see that one here, folks?
Yep.
I've taken an example that's kind of timely here, but it's the path to net zero, and at the same time, the reconciliation with our Indigenous people. Is there a connection here? I say there's actually an enormously profound connection. The path to net zero requires a fundamental rethink of our energy system, and that is about more mining, more land use, more wires, more waste. There is also about economic opportunity. There's about a just transition that deals with historic inequities and access to energy. And we've got the findings of our Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and the fact that our Indigenous peoples are also rights holders. It's not just about looking for a handout. There's rights here. And so I'm just saying, if you look at this through the concept of public authorities, there's a variety of ways we could bring a value perspective to that intersection that perhaps makes it more human, and therefore has the potential of creating enduring strategies that don't get into our current phenomenon of policy churn. Every time a new party's elected, the first job is to undo the decisions of the previous party. So that's it here, Perry. I hope that's of use, even though perhaps it's a little different perspective than what you folks have been talking about in the previous webinars, but open to the discussion. Over to you.
That was superb. I mean, I think what you really gave us was a good insight into the sources of chaos at a very high level, and the challenges to leadership on whether or not, in a world of evolution or maybe revolution, and I think that's a point to discuss as well, is the best form of leadership one that is top down, where some source of knowing what is best for all is in power and uses its influence as a leader to change society from the top down, or is the most appropriate during a period of change such as we're going through, bottom up, that spends time in consultation. And I think raising the point that you've done on reconciliation is in itself an interesting topic, because reconciliation, when achieved, is usually two-way. And the discussion to this date seems to be only one way: blame, guilt, apologies. And I'm not sure that we really have true reconciliation underway. It seems to be almost an imposition of one party on another. But you've opened up our discussion into the sources of chaos. It's now your turn, Peter Stockland. Over to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks for the chance to do this. I'm going to kind of take it in a almost, I guess, the opposite direction, down to more of a sort of sidewalk level. And I want to kind of get where I want to go through the lens of mental illness. And if I were being flippant, which I guess I am being flippant, I would say that, someone who spent his entire life as a journalist watching politics is, despite no university credentials, well equipped to talk about mental illness from both sides of it. But I want to talk about it seriously. When I was a kid, my dad worked in downtown Vancouver. He worked on the downtown east side. He worked for the CPR, but their building was right down on East Hastings Street. And from time to time, he would take me in. He'd take me to work with him, and I'd get bored and sitting around in his office and wander around the streets of the downtown east side. This is back in the 1960s. And so where the social dislocations, the addiction, all the things that we're so familiar with now, were really confined to a very small area of Vancouver. I mean, they obviously existed far more broadly, but in their public visible form, they were pretty much bounded by a couple of blocks in downtown Vancouver. And I was just a kid. I was like, I don't know, probably 12 years old, 11, 12 years old. But I used to love to go there and watch. And I would ask myself, what's going on with those folks? What's happening? How did they get here? What are they about? The thing I didn't do, and I suppose maybe I was too young, but the thing I've always resisted doing, and is what I sort of want to get to, is saying, what's the system that can cure them? What's the system that can fix them? What's the system that can make everything right? That's always been a kind of antithetical approach to me. And maybe that's why I ended up going into journalism, because I think most journalists don't believe that you can simply have a system that's going to work. I think both their experience and their inclinations teach them otherwise. But certainly for me, from a very early age, and it's something that I've persisted in over these many years. I make a point of walking around with a pocket full of change, but not just to hand out, but to actually stop and have conversations with people who are clearly in the conditions that we understand from associated with mental illness. It's just something I like to do, just to be present to them, listen and gather their stories. The segue, I mean, this is really when chaos becomes an existential threat. That is the definition of chaos as an existential individual threat. But I want to make the argument that at a particular level, it's an existential threat to the way we live. And it wasn't actually, I don't think it was actually identified in some of the other things that we heard. But I think it's one of those things that whether we want to view it metaphorically or as a reality, it is something that, and particularly in the aftermath of the pandemic, that is really, really, really a significant and serious thing that we've got to address, and we've got to come to some kind of I don't know, I guess understanding of, but we're going to have to deal with it because I mean, we've all heard anecdotally or in our own reading the mental health problems that have emerged out of the pandemic. A lot of the people I see now are clearly people and talk to are clearly people who have been hanging on by their fingernails or were pre-pandemic are now just lost. I mean, they're in just a kind of a chaos that almost defies description. But where I kind of want to go with this, a couple of years ago, I did a series on homelessness and went back to the downtown east side, which I just kept familiar with. But I met a guy there named Ronie Grigg, and Ronnie is to me the essence of what I see as an effective leader. Nobody knows Ronnie's name. He's not a politician. He's not on city council. He doesn't have any systems to put in place. But Ronnie's this big, huge, bearded guy who during the opioid epidemic, the last one before the current one, basically spent his days rescuing people out of mud puddles in back alleys on the downtown east side. But he's an incredibly thoughtful guy, and he pushed forward the initiative of getting people higher up the food chain to understand that this is where these people that we see as homeless, this is actually where they live. This is actually their community. So we've got to put the services, we've got to put things in place for them. And they would get taken up to St. Paul's Hospital on Burrard and then just discharged. And there was this intractable problem about, why do they keep drifting back down to the downtown east side? Well, that's because where they live. The people that were figuring out the systems that were building the structures kind of didn't have that intuitive sense that Ronie had, that this is actually where they live, and this is how we have to address the problem. And so he put in a number of you could call them triage initiatives that actually took into account that this is the reality on the ground. This is the nature of the problem that we have to deal with. That segues for me into a piece I was reading last weekend. There's a guy in Southern California. There's Andrew Scull, who's a sociologist. He teaches at the University of California at San Diego, and he's for 50 years, actually going back to the time when I was hanging out down in the downtown east side watching. He's a sociologist. He's not a psychologist or psychiatrist, but he spent 50 years dealing with mental health issues, with the mentally ill, with the errors that the mental health industry, if I can call it that without it being too pejorative, has created by some of the systems that it in all good faith believed were solutions to the problem, and certainly were better than the solutions that had been proposed up to that time, except ultimately they led to the catastrophic circumstance that we see now. And two things that Andrew Scull says in this interview, and I recommend it to you. One is a reality that we all know, and I think we all don't want to, or most of us don't want to admit, is that the homeless and sidewalk psychotics are now part of the fabric of our cities. You know, it's not the downtown, the east side anymore. I was standing on Bloor Street just 2 evenings ago, talking to my wife on the phone, and a guy came along shouting at shadows and just pushed me into a wall, and then just walked off, and everybody that saw him coming just ducked out of the way. I mean, that's how close it is. A friend of mine who works, and we share an office downtown, or office building. Some guy walked in off the street the other day and started talking to her about demonic possession. It wasn't making a particle of sense, but I mean, we're all very, very familiar with these kinds of circumstances. And it is now part of the fabric of our cities. It's part of the fabric of our lives. But here's what to me is the most compelling thing that Andrew Scull, the sociologist, said in apropos of leadership and apropos of chaos becoming an existential threat, and how we fend that off, or how we deal with it. He said, what impresses me most is how recalcitrant mental illness is, how it's best to be honest about what we don't know. And that to me seems like an essential problem in so much of our life, particularly in political life, but really in large swaths, large areas of what, for want of a better phrase, I'll call leadership life. There's this sense that we cannot be honest about what we don't know. And I think that's a shift frankly, from even when I was a kid growing up. I mean, I think there was still something of a willingness to admit, look, we really don't know, but we have these intractable problems. And we believe that if we just put our heads together and put our foreheads against each other, we'll find a solution, but we don't know that. And so our politics is infused. I was talking to I did an interview actually with a politician, a former politician, former Liberal, Ontario Liberal cabinet minister, just the other day. And he said, you know, the deepest problem, and this is really where I want to go. He said, the deepest problem in politics today is that the public expects politicians to know everything, and politicians play to that. They just pander to that idea. And he said, like the example he uses, you know, people have this, they bring up, this was his example, but the boil water advisory on indigenous territories. And they have this vision that Justin Trudeau has a file folder with boil water advisory solution on it, and all he has to do is get around to signing it, and everything will be fine. And you know what? Nothing that Justin Trudeau do, and I don't mean to be partisan here, but nothing that he does or most other politicians do disabuses people of that notion. It's part of the theater. It's part of the dynamic. We know we have the solution. We just have to get the opposition out of the way to let us get there. I think that's a really, 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 I'm going to say dangerous, if not existentially threatening mentality to have, an approach to have. Just to lapse back a little bit, the way our streets, our cities have become, their fabric has become the homeless and sidewalk psychotics. We all remember back in the early 60s, the emptying out of institutions, which was going to be this great systemic solution to everything, except part of the system just never appeared, which was the community supports that were supposed to be put in place, or at least they were very, very delayed. And by that time, maybe it was too late. I don't want to be pessimistic, but certainly what we see now and the compounding effect that I'm convinced we're going to have from the pandemic it's an example where bright people in best good faith thought they knew what to do. And as I said earlier, frankly, it was an improvement over what had happened in the 1950s, where scientists and psychologists, psychiatrists treated the mentally ill by, as Andrew Scull uses the example of taking a hammer and effectively tapping a nail through somebody's eye socket and cutting part of their brain off so that they didn't experience seizures or other manifestations of mental illness. That was in the 1950s. That was cutting edge, no pun intended, scientific treatment because people believed, well, we know that this is going to work, and it did until it didn't. Similarly, the solution that emerged in the 60s, it worked until it didn't. And this I'll call it performative idea that we have to pretend we know. I just think it's so incredibly dangerous. One of the things that I've tried to do, I've had, as Doug mentioned, we were editorial page editors. He came after me. I was the editor-in-chief at the Gazette in Montreal. I ran a bunch of magazines for Reader's Digest, and now I'm the publisher of the Catholic Register. I founded a bunch of magazines. And in the interim, and my approach has always been to tell staff, everybody has a prerogative and an obligation to say, why are we doing it that way? Why do we do it that way? We're not going to have a 3-hour philosophical discussion about it, but everybody should be challenging all the time and should be asking why. And when I think of the people that, aside from Ronie Grigg, the people that I think of as really manifesting what I consider leadership, they're the people that ask why, like they're the people that ask either Socratic questions that lead us to an understanding that we actually think we know a lot more than we do actually know, or they cause us to reconsider what it is we treat as knowledge, or they ask rhetorical questions. And Doug mentioned Trudeau, a quote from Trudeau. The quote that I love best from, this is as a Westerner, I grew up, my mother taught me from a young age to say, Pierre Idiot Trudeau. Like that was part of my growing up. But his question, why should I sell your wheat? Any Westerner over a certain age remembers that infamous question. That was a rhetorical question to get people to think about the complexities of selling wheat. What's actually involved here, rather than just assuming that somebody somewhere has a solution to this. So I think that to go from that sense of sort of individual chaos of people who and we've left them alone to fend for themselves. And in a way, our political structures have done that too, by bifurcating society, at least bifurcating it, if not dividing it up into even smaller segments of those who know and those who don't. A kind of almost, what the political scientist, it was just going to, the new science of politics, Eric Vogelin, called the Gnostic dream world. That there are these people, who understand and who know, and they will lead us to the New Jerusalem. Well, I mean, I actually happen to, as a publisher of the Catholic Register, happen to give some importance to Jerusalem, but I prefer to the Gnostic dream world a certain historical and supernatural individual, if you want to allow me that, who said, "Who do people say I am?" Who answered by asking questions of people, by saying, why do you believe that? Why do you do that? And so the antidote, if I can propose an antidote on the top of all this, an antidote is to take the fact that we're not trapped the way mentally ill people are, but we are trapped in a very confusing time. And Bob gave us a wonderful example of just why things are so confusing because of the interconnections. But we do live in not just a confusing time, a confusing world. Life itself is confusing, and that's where we have to start. That's where we have to say, okay, why, how, when, why are we doing this? Why should we accept this? And we have to move away from a politics and a social performance that says we know best. No. This is the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'd be happy to try and unpack some of this if you want to ask questions. But the chaos that really exists, I'm sure you've all experienced the phenomenon of urban invisibility, where somebody with a mental illness or in a state of disorientation enters into whatever it might be, onto a bus, on a sidewalk, in a metro car, wherever it might be, and everybody goes invisible. right? They just don't want to look, and they think that by not looking, they're actually whoever the person is can't see them or doesn't know that they're there. Well, we've done that to a large extent in a political way and in a social way. When problems emerge, we either go into urban invisibility mode, or we go into, as we saw during the pandemic demonstrations, hyper aggressive mode. And it's the same thing. We know the answer. We know what should be done. Instead of asking why is that the right way to go? Why should we do it that way? Instead of not just assuming that there is this Gnostic elite that knows the best way, because frankly, they don't.
So Peter, I think you've really grounded us in the foundations of chaos when they arrive at an individual level by pointing to an example of people with mental illness and almost asking whether we are all suffering some form of that as we live through chaos, either because we're living in the street or we're living on a globe where change is occurring so rapidly that to know is no longer the answer. I was taking notes as you were speaking on 2 points. One, the age of reason, which began really after the Renaissance, was an age of knowledge. I put this book up on the shelf called The Future of the Professions. The professions were built at the end of the Middle Ages, the end of the Middle Ages, where those in knowledge had power over those who did not. One were called clients because they didn't know, and the other were called professionals because they did know. And that power relationship brought us to the 21st century quite well. And the public systems that were built and that we revere in Canada were public systems built on those that knew, the doctors, the teachers, the professionals, the engineers, the lawyers. We built public institutions in order to serve people. The challenge is, when they were first built, people did not know. And now they do know. And they're no longer prepared to be clients one step above a slave or one step below a professional. They now want to be consumers, and they now challenge the professions. So we live in a world today which is much more chaotic because we don't have this orderly relationship anymore between those that knew, and we gave them power because they did know, and those that didn't know. Now, coming back to the topic of mental health, I urge you to read a book called Madness and Civilization by Michael Foucault, who wrote about backwards to back alleys.
Yeah.
And he pointed, we've gone through this cycle dozens of times, always based on an ideology that the backwards were inadequate, they were inhuman, they were ill-prepared to serve people. We'll go back to community where they went to the back alleys. We've been through this cycle many times before, and my concern is in the pursuit now of order, we will purge communities of those with mental illness, and we'll go back to the institutional option, or what we're doing today is filling them with phenothiazines and saying, well, the drugs will solve the problem. And we will manage order and we'll get rid of this chaos by either drugging them or getting rid of them and cleaning communities again up by putting them back in an institutional form of environment. So that's one way you get rid of chaos, is just get rid of it. What ultimately takes us, as I use the parable of when God dismissed Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden because they were in pursuit of knowledge and lost faith. This chasing of knowledge since the Middle Ages may have been a bit of a trap, because I suspect he said, you'll be back. And faith will become restored, because right now, I don't think continuing to pursue knowledge, as much as the promise of surveillance and having data about you as a person, we can do so much better that the leaders today say, if we only know more about you, we can serve you better. That can be taken to the element of we will control you better, as opposed to personalization saying we will give you what you are seeking, what you want. Anyway, you have brought us almost full circle. So I'm going to open it up to the full group. Pursuit to establish order in the face of chaos. China takes a very different approach. China has no reservations of imposing order in the interest of public safety, regardless of the individual consequences, whereas the West seems to be much more sensitive to personal expression, meaning a higher level of tolerance is called for in the West because individual expression is so highly revered. We've got an East-West tension right now as to who's right. And maybe the only answer of who's right is based on your culture. I'm sure the leaders, Doug, that you cited may not be the same leaders that would be cited in Asia.
But there's a difference, Perry, I think, between a leader who leads and a leader who imposes his will. So, I mean, when you look at China,
a good example is Gandhi. Gandhi's mantra was, "There they go, I must hasten after them, for I am their leader." He had a vision, and that vision mobilized people like Peter Lougheed did.
Yeah.
And people chased that vision, and he didn't need to be in front of the pack in order for them to go there. That was a visionary.
I mean, that's why you see problems in communist countries. So often people will obey because life could get very uncomfortable if they didn't obey. But that doesn't mean they buy into a particular leader's vision, I don't think.
So are we spending too much time as politicians fixing individual problems versus articulating a vision?
I wanted to pick up on something that Peter said that really struck me as well, around this whole issue of, we live in an age where you have to have an answer. You have to have an instant answer. I was thinking about this last night as I was watching the hockey game and watching instant analysis of whatever ridiculous play had just happened. And it seems to me there's a direct correlation between the quality of the analysis and the amount of time you put into it. You know, people demand instant answers, so they get instantly bad answers. What if a politician had the courage to say, "I don't know. I'll be interested in investigating that and finding out"? Would they get eaten alive today? I wonder.
Is saying "I don't know" the same as making an apology? We seem to have some politicians that don't care about knowing. All they care about is getting credit for apologizing. I know you're smiling, but you know where I'm going.
Yeah.
I mean, apologizing at one point, I remember people gave Klein credit because he was humble enough to say, "No, I didn't get it right." I remember asking Klein personally when we were pursuing privatization, and I was director of privatization, and I asked him, I said, if that's an ideology, when do we know enough is enough? If it's a management option, we'll make a decision at some point when we've reached an end. And he said, "I'll know when enough is enough, when we hit the bone." And I thought, that's pretty raw politics. I remember talking to another politician in Alberta that said, what politics is all about is making sure there are no shocks. We got plenty of shocks today.
You know, Ralph also asked one of the great questions in Canadian political history. There was the argy-bargy going on between the Catholic schools, separate schools, and the public school system, over, you know, there was a funding kerfuffle going on, and the Catholics were complaining they weren't getting enough and their taxes should be redistributed differently and blah, blah, blah. And Ralph said, "What's the difference between a Catholic paperclip and a Protestant paperclip?" And everybody went, "Oh, what he said." And then like I started asking people, well, what is the difference? Is there a difference? Well, no, I guess not. You know, like, and but it forced everybody to go, okay, why do we have this system? Why do we need this system? Let's think back to why we justify, you know, and you can come up with a justification or not, but it forced everybody to go, okay, hang on. Yeah, that's not a bad question, actually. Why do we have Catholic paperclips and Protestant paperclips?
You've brought another dimension of good leadership to the surface there. Sometimes great consultants ask great questions. Great leaders don't necessarily give you an answer, but get you thinking about an issue before. I mean, the discussions going on in Alberta right now, you might not be aware of this, Peter. There is pretty significant discussion going on about the Republic of Alberta, about opting out. Either seriously or simply to get the federal government into a discussion again about what is this country as it relates to energy policy, as it relates to our relationships with others on the world at large. But there's something going on which is shaking the very foundations of Canada when one of the provinces or a few provinces feel that they've become handmaidens to the East. And they're prepared to get out and say, we'll suffer the consequences if necessary. Quebec tried it and stayed in. This discussion, which will go on now in Alberta among the conservatives may well touch upon the energy issues and the frustrations of whether or not Alberta is really being listened to by leaders at a national level, and whether the appeal court of Canada or of Alberta recently got it right about the pipelines legislation. So there's major issues going on in this country on issues of leadership in energy, on issues of leadership in healthcare, on whether or not our religion of a commitment to public health, public education, public society is being challenged. And maybe enough is enough. Maybe we need more private enterprise within a country that has been built. We've been a nation building for 200 years on our public health, public education, and civil government. Maybe it's time we loosened up a little bit.
I was saying too about this kind of instant need to know. Like, it struck me for quite a long time now that that's really the essential problem of with social media. It's not that just that people say stupid things or noxious things or terrible things. It's that they feel compelled to do it. And the normal social safeguards that used to be in place to ease that feeling of compulsion, to make people hesitate before they spoke up, have, like, I always say, we hear the metaphor that Twitter is like a bar room at two in the morning when everybody's off their face, except it isn't, because in a bar room at 2 in the morning, as we all know, you still watched your mouth because you might get punched in the mouth if you didn't. And like on Twitter, you're not going to get punched in the mouth. Like, nobody's going to reach through the screen. And like, that's crude, but it's actually a social condition that limits people from just feeling like they have to jump in and say something. You don't. If you don't have anything to say, don't say it. And if what you're going to say isn't considered for the effects that it might have, then maybe don't say that either. But social media breaks down all those barriers, or all those costs, I guess, what we would call costs more than even barriers.
Well, in breaking them down, they may well have been attacking leadership as a concept, as a fundamental concept in society. Where individual expression is so highly revered, we may be living in a society today where leadership is equated to autocracy. Leadership is equated to control. Leadership is equated to I know and you don't. If that's the case, then this discussion on leadership is coming to recognize that maybe we're going through a period where people don't want to be led, and we're going through more of a revolution as it relates to knowledge, and are going to have to tolerate this chaos until it settles down and we form new institutions. It may be the form of governance that we've been used to needs in itself to change.
Well, I think people are better informed than they have been in the past, sometimes falsely informed, but are not prepared to accept anything that anyone says at face value, unless it happens to speak to their own beliefs. There is such a thing as
So it's a period of skepticism is alive, well, and healthy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean,
we're seeing that certainly. I mean, science is based on an element of skepticism.
If a doctor tells me I'm dying of cancer, my first response is going to be, I want a second opinion.
Right. Well, I mean, that's what this book, The Future of the Professions, is really all about. Is the professions today, and I did some research on this where we canvassed our professions throughout Alberta in engineering, education, and health about whether or not the client was changing. The client that they knew and were educated to serve was the client they were seeing today, and they said absolutely not. The client carries a cell phone with them. In fact, the doctor is carrying the cell phone with them. When you give your doctor your symptoms, the first thing he may well be doing is consulting. We just went through this on a domestic level, where the doctor in front of us was looking up the symptoms to determine whether they were associated with the medication. I'm going to shift gears just a little bit and take us into the health system for a moment. This is a public system. It claims it's interested in the public, and you are one of the public, therefore it's there to serve you. I went into emergency recently. Why is irrelevant? It was fascinating. It was an education to look at the 50 to 100 people that came into emergency. They are not your middle class. These were the poor. These are people with untied sneakers. These are people with torn jeans, not as a fashion statement, but this was their clothing. This was the population you talk of, Peter. We live in a society where 50% of the people are below average in income or in intelligence that are struggling a little bit. And we're becoming much more aware, and the media spend much more time talking about them and getting rid of poverty. The new mayor or city manager in Edmonton says his mission is to make Edmonton safe and get rid of poverty. Well, good luck. I mean, it's a statistical measure on when 50% doesn't exist anymore. But leaders come out with statements like this, and there's a lot of skepticism on whose dollar and whose jobs will be won or lost.
Oh, all right. Thank you. I just wanted to say when you started speaking, I was thinking of because you were talking about China. China has 3 priorities, and I don't mean this facetiously. Social stability is number 1. So social stability is number 2, and social stability is number 3. I mean, we don't have a policy like that in our country. We just assume it will be like that. They plan it and try to make sure that, and especially the latest 5-year plans are going to change the world by the time they complete what they say they're going to do. I recommend that you look up what China plans to be in the year 2035.
But with China,
they've set the goals in the latest 5-year plans.
We may not differ in terms of China as it relates to the goals, but we may differ dramatically in what means are to be used to achieve it.
Their means are very similar to our means in trying to achieve goals. I'm not talking about on the intelligence, military, geopolitical side. I'm just talking about economics and well-being of society. And they have a very aggressive plan, which I am very impressed with. I've been analyzing this on behalf of our embassy in Beijing.
I guess the comment I'd make is that I found that a lot of the discussion is focused on a very specific leader, and that is a politician. And I say it does a disservice to the scope of leadership that we actually need for addressing issues in this chaotic world. I'm looking at a gallery of a bunch of leaders on my screen here. But if we look at leadership in healthcare in our hospitals, we look at leadership in our universities, we look at leadership in our economy. I think what we need is this constant reinforcement of what is the concept of the public good in Canada, and that we are encouraging and rewarding people that put their hands up and say, I'm prepared to contribute to the public good. By contrast, we have allowed, and we as us, we have allowed too much politics into politics. And the political process has changed in my career in dramatic ways. No longer is politics about views of the public good and trying to bring those forward. And once elected, focused on the right policies with the right and best advice to move forward. Everything is politics, everything. And what is it all about? Power. And how much of the power is actually driven by backroom political staffers who are gaming the system to ensure that their people get in power. And frankly, folks, we have allowed it to happen. We have to take back politics. The phenomenon of politicization, polarization, partisanship is a phenomenon that has, perhaps it's been exacerbated by social media, but we as a society have allowed that to happen. There are many other areas where I think the public good is on full display with leaders. But right now, I fear that in the political sphere, we have allowed politics to become all about the game of power. and not looking after the well-being of our nation. Maybe I'm being a bit extreme in my comments, but I really feel it. I recall how many discussions I would have with senior public servants and with ministers over my career, where we're debating the right public policy, the right approach to solving the problem. What I found at the end of my career, to even get time with the minister, I had to get through the political chief of staff. And the first test was whether what I was proposing and bringing to the table was going to be consistent with the party policy. The gatekeeping was incredible. And so we have allowed the system to go in directions that are extremely unhealthy. How do we reclaim it? That is the challenge ahead of us.
Some years ago, public policy was formulated in consultation with a strong public service. The public service system was at that time viewed as somewhat independent of government, and it was there to do the analysis, to do the consultations, to formulate policy options, and to take them forward. And then the public sector was gutted. I remember that under Steve West in Alberta, consciously gutted in the interest of giving the politicians more say and not being influenced by the public service sector. I think that was a huge mistake, and I think we're still suffering through it. And maybe that's taken place in other sectors, Bob. But a respected public service does that analysis, does that consultation, and brings forward options. But when it's only politicians conferring with politicians, all about retaining and getting more power, and you often see that in centralized systems. I can recall when I was a manager in the public sector, management principles, accountability were the measures of success. But when I was promoted to assistant deputy minister, it was no longer management principles. It was what could we do to accumulate and maintain power. And I found that startling. And it took me about a year to figure out why the decision-making at the policy level in headquarters was so different than the policy at the regional level. And it had to do with the management and retention of power. So you're bang on. Dale, you want to jump in here?
Sure. Peter had brought forward is very interesting. He might remember Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, a Jesuit, who talks about how the structure of having the president became what they fought, but that then became what they emulated. And I think as we look at how even we today are looking to solve the problem, we are very much influenced by a neo-feudal. And I think people were talking about, well, is this top down or is it bottom up? And I think that the new word that's coming out is neo-feudal. We're in a neo-feudal system that looks at technology, looks at consumerism, looks at militarism, looks at power that we talked about. And all of them have tools that they use. And we need to understand that regardless of that, we have values that actually transcend those. I remember quite a while ago, I gave a little bit of a look at what values are, like freedom, responsibility, fairness, respect. But we also looked at, and I think Peter and most of us are saying we're looking for a leader, but that leader's inside. And when we looked at Maslow and the concept of a transcendent, it really comes individually, and that's where the free market, and that's where we can't expect the state or a leader to figure it out because they don't know any more than we do. Now, they have lots of people around them, and how they use those systems, and those systems now with the fourth industrial revolution are getting much more sophisticated and are being wielded by people that may or may not be in our favor. And the voice that we could actually receive if we try to figure the process out actually is almost paradoxical, because there are real values that we look at, and we're going to hit different things every day. It is too complex when Jordan Peterson says, clean up your room, because if you're going to go try to fix the world, it's way too complex to fix. And so in some ways, we're even trying to do that here. And we're not even, sort of recognizing, well, maybe we're recognizing that. And I think some of us are. So the process then, I think, goes down to the issue of values. One of the things that we've already brought up is family. Right now, the NDP is talking about family. What is family? What is the responsibility and right of family? Those are issues that when you're looking at leadership, when you're looking at things like the faith, the right faith, those are other issues that as you look at them, we get a consensus and facing and pointing in the same direction if we have transcendent values. Oftentimes when we're looking at policies, etc., talking about the vulnerable, if we actually thought of creating policies for the vulnerable as actually the way forward for us to develop our technology in a sustainable, human, pervasive way, it turns us on its head. And we do have the technology to do that. I'm right now working as a campaign manager for the UCP. And when we're asking the questions now, we're literally using those 4 values of parental right, faith, the vulnerable, and of course the economy. We don't want to burden our children with a slavery of an economic overlord, whoever it is, the IMF or WEF or UN or whatever it's going to be. Those are values I think that many of us can connect with. We also did another survey that looked at all the current values. We looked at what are all the issues that might be coming up, and there are certain ways that if we frame that transcendently, we can actually provide a unity. It's when we actually position ourselves in those camps. And thank you, Peter. You were very eloquent in identifying that. When we and Perry, you remember Wolf Wolfensberger. When there's an us and a them, it creates death making, because the them always ends up the underling, the oppressed, or almost perversely the convicted or victimized person that ends up being the radicalized trans or identity politics or whatever victimhood they have. So we've turned it on its head, and I think we can turn it around by seeking each of us to look how we can actually be transparent with each other and connect with each other in a way that moves us forward, that we agree on. And some of that takes sacrifice. We know from the well, just the archetypal stories of the world. Heroes come out of chaos and fight the dragons, and the transcendent essentially is the vision that we all take, that take us all together so uniquely that we can't figure that out. But in that, the politicians should be reflecting our voice rather than being neo-feudal lords. And that there's so much more to discuss, but certainly.
Well, an excellent point. I mean, I think you reinforced one that was made earlier. We have politicized way too much. I mean, when we were nation building, we spent time on roads and economy and issues of infrastructure. The public sector and the government was spent more time in the building, but now we've gotten on the social side. And it seems to me government is intervening way beyond what we have been accustomed to on issues of transgenderism, on issues of family. I can recall being in front of a school of social work some years ago where the family was viewed as archaic and the state could do a better job. And the sooner we got kids into daycare, the better society would be, because many or most families were inadequate. That type of dialogue, frankly, scares the hell out of me. But it is 4:30. I'm going to go through one more round of questions. And you want to share with us, Jeff, from your perspective?
This has been a fantastic topic, and I've so enjoyed Bob's and Doug's and Peter's presentations tonight. It's been really thought-provoking. I wanted to ask all of the presenters, I know we've used the terms management and leadership kind of interchangeably in a few of the presentations. And I always liked Stephen Covey's example of the crew of people working in the forest, cutting down the trees. And one of the people, a guy or a gal, shimmies up one of the trees and looks out over the horizon and yells down to the group, "Hey, we're in the wrong jungle." And the managers down below yell up to the person up to the top of the tree and say, "Well, shut up, we're making progress." We confuse leadership with management, and sometimes our politicians are, as someone has pointed out, just ideologically driven. And sometimes they are bureaucrats or technocrats, and they're not leaders. And the environment that Bob described so eloquently, with all of those interdependencies and interconnections, and the proliferation of communications platforms, we've been so fragmented that I think leaders have an inherently more difficult job today in even crystallizing an issue to have people rally around. Like you mentioned, Lougheed. Lougheed was brilliant in what he accomplished in Alberta, right? And so was Klein in his way. But they were both crystallizing attention and activity around topics that resonated with people. And now what happens is a voice tries to rise above the din and express something that people need to rally around, and they are within 10 seconds drowned out by 50 other things that all seem just as important. And some of those other things are actually counter programming that is intentionally promoted by other interests. And I think and what seems to me for leadership is, you mentioned the word disruption, Perry. And the other element of this is change. And what leaders need to do is be the right person at the right time with the right message that crystallizes attention and energy. And that is a dynamic that is undermined by so many of these other forces that are present in our society now more than they ever have been. And that's all compounded by the fact that the pace of change is accelerating and the rate of change is accelerating. And so how does somebody who is in a position of leadership, how do they rise above that and actually reduce options? It's not about expanding them, because there's already billions of them, but how do you crystallize and focus attention in the way that it needs to be focused? That's, to me, where the next great leader will emerge, is that someone who can, and maybe it's going to be climate change, or maybe it's going to be, we saw the Pentagon hearings yesterday about alien, maybe it's going to be the alien invasion, maybe it'll be another, maybe it's going to be monkeypox. God knows, who knows what it's going to be. But anyways, those are the things that were running through my mind. And I thought all three presentations were just phenomenal.
So, some leaders have been noteworthy because they were brilliant at administration, maintaining the status quo and making sure that all that existed worked more efficiently. You pointed out a very interesting phenomenon that we haven't talked at great length, which is one of the sources of chaos in Alberta, for example, is we have 23,000 nonprofit societies. Every part of your body and every disease you can imagine has an association tied into it. How the hell do you develop public policy when you've got to confer with hundreds of advocates, all asking for more, almost all of them on government handout of some dole of a grant? I mean, this in itself needs to be fixed. Yes. The amount of chaos that exists as a byproduct of 23,000 special interest groups going to government to ask for a handout and or being bought. I mean, this is the problem in Nova Scotia, is the number of agencies that are bought and rely on the public dollar. There are so many dollars sitting in government and so many pigs at the trough that just elevates the complexity of governing when you've got so many to pander to, all of whom carry one thing: can we get more votes, and what's it going to cost? Barry, you've been there.
That we haven't figured out how to trust anybody. We've got to learn how to trust each other, and I will stop at that, except to add, I worked with for 10 years as board member and chair of the board of a post-secondary in Canada, in Alberta, and related to what I just said. And Dr. Tom Thompson wrote a book, small book, that he used very successfully used and we used as a how to manage in this chaotic world, and it's called Governance as Leadership. And it's directed towards the post-secondary system, but if you dig your own mind through what the words that are given there with one particular industry, you will find, or we found as a board, we found a system that works. And it worked for us and is still working for them 10 years after both Tom and I have left the organization. And it's a college, but it's a college that is really, in its field, the leader of training our future workers in that area.
One name that hasn't come up is Elon Musk. And Elon is someone who's certainly a bit of a nut. He's very entertaining, but he's also hugely successful. And so you might ask yourself, well, what is it? What's the quality that he has? Is there a quality there that we can learn from? And I think to put it in very simple terms, I call it the big picture guy. And we talk about what's the challenge, 23,000 not-for-profit organizations, how do you deal with that? Well, you don't. You look at the big picture. You get up to the 30,000 foot level and try to look at the larger ideas and larger concepts and stay focused on that. That's what a leader needs to do. And that'll be my part.
Thanks, Doug. Robert? Bob? You're still, there you go.
Yeah, no, I'm extremely thoughtful here. I guess I'd come back and say tackling the 3 Ps here. We have to take back our political system and reward leadership. Leadership in these days is enormously complex, but the leaders that I have said are leaders have this enormous ability to set the tone, to provide the context, to empower and to build relationships. And those skills are in short supply too much. Let's make sure the next generation of youth that are going to take over behind us have those skills.
Peter?
I was just going to follow up on what Bob was saying, particularly. But I think a necessary component of what he's talking about, and I totally agree with the idea of the need to take back our politics, but we have to do some self-examination too. And as the conversations proceeded, I just keep going back to many of you are longtime Albertans will remember the late Ken King, who of course ran the Flames and ran the Stampeders, but he was my publisher at the Calgary Herald and at the Calgary Sun as well. I think Ken had left by the time you got there, Doug. But
Yeah.
One of Ken's favorite quotations was from Don Getty, who during the constitutional wars of the late 80s and early 90s used to say, okay, wait a minute. We went down there to try and recraft the Constitution, but you thought I was too much of an idiot to do that. So you told me to come back and fix the economy. Wait a minute, what's going on here? If I'm too stupid to fix the Constitution, how can I fix something as complex as the economy? I can't. And I to that point, I will never forget as long as I live. Peter Lougheed giving a speech at the Convention Center in Edmonton and coming out, and his first line was, "What's happening in Riyadh?" And everybody in the room, all the oil patch guys went, Riyadh, did something happen in Riyadh? Like, it was supposed to be a provocative line. It actually kind of fell flat because it confused everybody. But Lougheed's challenge was, these are complex problems. You can't say you're too much of an idiot to fix this. Now get over here and fix this. You've got to accept that there's an intractability to all of it, and you come up with the best possible solutions. And I think as people engaged in taking back politics, we've got to go forward with that attitude that they're not idiots. There's all the problems in the world. There's the gatekeepers to get by and all the rest of it. But at the same time, we have to ask a lot. We shouldn't ask too much, and we shouldn't ask a kind of bifurcated thing where you're an idiot over here, but fix everything else that really can't be fixed other than just by the passage of time.
Well, it is wrap up time, and I'll make a concluding observation. Leaders are often born or they're situational. I think, Doug, you alluded to that. Peter, you've referenced the need for leadership associated with a specific problem of homelessness. As a point of hope, we may be facing some pretty serious issues that are global in nature in the coming years. Climate change at one point galvanized an awful lot of behavior. We now have a war. We have inflation in the economy. We've just gone through COVID. Each one of these creates a situation and a moment for leadership, but we seem to have really struggled through some of these recent events where leadership never really did show up. It had the capability of galvanizing attention and being the party or the voice in order to guide us through a crisis, whether it be in the coming forecasts of food shortages, continued problems in supply chains. We have issues that are global in nature that may ultimately surface a leader like Zelensky was or is in the Ukraine, or as Putin tried to be in Russia. I don't know where that leadership's going to come from. Hopefully it will be values-based. And I want to thank all of you, Doug, for your time today, Peter, for your input, and Robert, for coming back again. Your analysis was superb. And thank you all. Have a very, very good weekend and welcome springtime.